The day Britain died as an empire in 7 days. November 5, 1956. Before dawn. In a room at 10 Downing Street, a Prime Minister sits with his head in his hands. His eyes are red. He hasn't slept in 3 days. His name is Anthony Eden. Across the desk, an Air Force general stands holding a manila folder. He has just delivered his report. British paratroopers have landed at Port Said. 600 Marines. They're moving south. So far, no significant resistance. But there is one problem. The United States, their closest ally, has just threatened to destroy the British economy. Not with bombs. Not with troops. With money. The pound sterling is under attack on international markets. Britain's gold reserves are bleeding out at £3 million per hour. If this continues, in 7 days, the British Empire, the empire that once ruled a quarter of the Earth's surface, will be bankrupt. And the American president, Dwight Eisenhower, called Eden 2 hours ago. The call contained exactly one sentence. Anthony, stop this, or we will stop you. Eden looks at the general in front of him. He looks at the map of Egypt spread across the table. He remembers what he told his cabinet 6 months ago. We cannot allow this one man to strangle us, he said. He is a new Hitler. That one man. Gamal Abdel Nasser. President of Egypt. Son of a postman. An Arab socialist whose charisma sets the streets of Cairo on fire. And in the eyes of Anthony Eden, the most dangerous threat to the British Empire since Adolf Hitler. Now, in this room, Eden must choose. Continue the invasion, defy the American threat, and watch his country go bankrupt. Or stop everything, surrender the Suez Canal to Nasser, and announce to the world that the British Empire is dead. This is not a story about a war. This is about the single week that ended 3 centuries of imperialism. About how a man so terrified of the past destroyed his own future. And about one question that, 60 years later, historians still cannot fully answer. Why did 3 of the most powerful nations in Europe, Britain, France, and Israel, secretly conspire to invade an Arab country that never even attacked them? The answer begins in a sandpit in Egypt. The year 1798. With a young French general looking for glory. And it ends at a small harbour called Port Said, where a 19-year-old British Marine watched the Union Jack lowered for the last time. This is the story of the Suez Crisis. This is the day Britain died as an empire. Before we enter the secret rooms, before we talk about the invasion and the conspiracy, we have to understand one thing first. Why a 193-kilometer strip of water could make 3 empires willing to destroy their own reputations. The Suez Canal was not the first waterway to connect the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. Pharaoh Senusret III tried to dig a similar canal 4,000 years ago. Darius of Persia tried. Ptolemy tried. They all failed because of the difference in water levels. But Suez was different. Suez was an idea born in the brain of a French diplomat named Ferdinand de Lesseps, a visionary who was never an engineer a single day in his life. he befriended an Egyptian prince while serving as vice-consul in Alexandria. The prince was named Muhammad Said. And when that prince became viceroy of Egypt in 1854, de Lesseps saw his chance. He rode to the palace. He bowed. And he said, "Your Highness, I can cut Africa's belly open. I can make Egypt the center of the world again. All trade from Europe to Asia, all the ships, all the spices, all the silk, all the gold, all of it will pass through your palace's backyard." Said signed the concession without reading the fine print. That was the first mistake. Digging began in 1859. And here is the part rarely told. De Lesseps did not use steam engines for most of the excavation. He used human beings. The corvée labor system. Forced labor. Egyptian peasants, the fellahin, were taken from their fields, forced to march hundreds of kilometers into the desert, and forced to dig the canal with bare hands and woven baskets. How many died? The official figure says 20,000. Modern historians estimate 100,000. Some contemporary accounts from French engineers themselves report 120,000 dead from cholera, dysentery, and exhaustion. One body every 2 meters. And when the canal was completed in 1869, Egypt was bankrupt from financing the project. Said was dead. His successor, Ismail Pasha, spent so much money on the canal and its opening ceremony that he had to sell Egypt's shares in the Suez Canal Company. The Suez opening ceremony was one of the most extravagant events in 19th century history. Ismail Pasha built a new palace in Cairo specifically for his guests. He commissioned the composer Verdi to write the opera Aida. He invited every king and queen in Europe. And in the middle of all that luxury, one guest from Britain saw something no other guest saw. He looked at a map. He looked at Egypt's position. He looked at India, the heart of the British Empire, at the eastern end. And he realized, whoever controls Suez controls the fastest route to India. Whoever controls the route to India controls the British Empire. The guest's name, Benjamin Disraeli, Prime Minister of Britain. 6 years later, in 1875, Ismail Pasha was completely bankrupt. He offered Egypt's shares in the Suez Canal Company to anyone who would pay. Disraeli did not wait for parliamentary approval. He borrowed £1 million from Lionel de Rothschild personally in just 24 hours. The Jewish banker asked, "What is your collateral?" Disraeli answered, "The British Empire." And just like that, Britain owned 44% of the Suez Canal. This was not a purchase. This was a financial coup. From that moment until 1956, Britain guarded the Suez Canal like a wolf guards its den. They stationed 80,000 soldiers in the canal zone during World War II. They refused to leave their military bases there even after Egypt gained independence in 1952. To London, Suez was not foreign policy. Suez was the artery. And on July 26, 1956, someone severed that artery. Gamal Abdel Nasser was born in Alexandria in 1918. His father was a postman. His mother was the daughter of a coal merchant. In a country dominated by Turkish Egyptian aristocrats and corrupt European elites, Nasser was supposed to be nobody. But Nasser had one talent that no elite school can teach. He could make people love him. The year is 1942. Nasser is a young officer in the Egyptian army. Britain still effectively occupies Egypt, even though the country is technically independent since 1922. One night, British tanks surround King Farouk's palace in Cairo. The British ambassador, Sir Miles Lampson, enters the palace carrying an ultimatum. Dismiss the Prime Minister, or we will shell your palace. The king surrenders. The Prime Minister is replaced. To most Egyptians, this is a routine humiliation. To Nasser, it is radicalization. He wrote to a friend, "I am ashamed that our army did nothing. I feel so humiliated that I could almost spit on my own uniform." That night, Nasser made a decision. He would not stop until no foreign soldier stood on Egyptian soil. 6 years later, 1948, he fought against the newly formed Israel. He was trapped at an outpost in Fallujah, same name as the Iraqi city, but this is a small village in Palestine. He was surrounded. He was bombed. But he refused to surrender. When he finally returned to Egypt after the defeat, he brought no victory. But he brought something more valuable. A narrative. "We were betrayed," he told his fellow officers. "It was not the army that lost. Our king, our generals, they sold us out." This was not entirely true. But it was not entirely false. And for frustrated young officers, it was the fire they needed. July 23, 1952. Before dawn, a group of young officers calling themselves the Free Officers move through the empty streets of Cairo. Nasser is the architect, but he appoints an older general, Mohammed Naguib, as the public face of the coup. King Farouk abdicates. He boards his luxury yacht, yes, he actually escapes on a yacht, and sails to Italy. He takes 204 suitcases. And Egypt, for the first time in 2,500 years, is ruled by a native Egyptian. Not a Persian. Not a Greek. Not a Roman. Not an Arab. Not a Turk. Not a Frenchman. Not a Briton. An Egyptian. Nasser was not a communist. He was not a capitalist. He developed his own ideology, Arab nationalism. One Arab nation, united, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Persian Gulf. And at the center of this vision was one impossible project. A dam. The Aswan Dam. The Nile River has flooded Egypt every summer for 10,000 years. These floods brought the fertile silt that allowed ancient Egyptian civilization to survive. But they also destroyed, killed, drowned villages. Nasser wanted to stop the floods. He wanted electricity. He wanted industrialization. He wanted the largest dam in the world, built in southern Egypt, to control the Nile forever. Cost $1.3 billion. In today's money, about $14 billion. Nasser did not have that kind of money. So he went to the bank. First bank he visited, the World Bank. The World Bank agreed to provide a loan on the condition that the United States and Britain also contribute funding. December 1955. Washington, D.C. American Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, a cold lawyer who despised uncertainty, sits in his office studying the aid proposal for Egypt. On paper, it makes strategic sense. Help Nasser build his dam, and you keep him from turning to the Soviet Union. But Dulles has a problem. The problem is not economic. The problem is personal. John Foster Dulles does not like Gamal Abdel Nasser. He does not like the way Nasser speaks to Western powers as equals rather than supplicants. He does not like Nasser's refusal to join the Baghdad Pact, the anti-Soviet alliance America is building in the Middle East. And he especially does not like what happened in April 1955. When Nasser showed up at the Bandung conference in Indonesia, standing shoulder to shoulder with India's Nehru and China's Zhou Enlai, and declared that the Third World would no longer be anyone's playground. But none of that is enough to kill the dam project. Not yet. What kills it happens in May 1956. Nasser recognizes the People's Republic of China. For John Foster Dulles, this is an unforgivable sin. China is the enemy. China is the regime that drove out America's ally Chiang Kai-shek. China is the communist giant that America refuses to acknowledge as legitimate. And Nasser, this postman's son from Alexandria, has just given China his diplomatic blessing. Dulles decides. There will be no American money for the Aswan Dam. But he does not simply withdraw the offer. That would be too straightforward. Dulles decides to humiliate Nasser publicly. He waits until July 19, 1956. Nasser's ambassador is summoned to the State Department. And Dulles delivers his message in the most condescending way possible. The United States has concluded that the Aswan Dam project is not feasible in its current form. The Egyptian economy lacks the capacity to sustain such an undertaking. Therefore, the United States is withdrawing its offer of financial assistance. Translation: You are too poor and too incompetent to build this dam, and we are announcing it to the world. He also, according to multiple accounts, makes a sneering reference to Nasser's background, suggesting that a postman's son has no business managing billion-dollar infrastructure. The British withdraw their offer the same day. Dulles thinks this will put Nasser in his place. He is catastrophically wrong. July 26, 1956. Alexandria, Egypt. It is the 4th anniversary of King Farouk's abdication. Nasser is scheduled to give a speech commemorating the revolution. Thousands gather in Manshia Square. Across Egypt, people huddle around radios. Nobody knows what is about to happen. Not the CIA station chief in Cairo. Not the British ambassador. Not Nasser's own cabinet. Nasser himself does not know, fully, what he will say. The speech is in his hand, typed, mundane, the standard celebration of the revolution. But in his pocket he carries something else. A contingency plan. An order. A gamble. Nasser steps to the podium. The speech begins normally. He talks about the revolution. He talks about the martyrs. he talks about the fallen soldiers who died fighting for Egypt's freedom. And then, about 30 minutes in, his tone changes. He mentions the Aswan Dam. He mentions how the World Bank, the Americans, the British all pulled their funding. He calls them imperialists. He calls them arrogant. He says they think Egypt will beg. And then he says a name. Ferdinand de Lesseps. The name means nothing to most Egyptians in 1956. De Lesseps has been dead for 62 years. But to Nasser, that name is not just a man. It is a code word. It is the signal. Years earlier, Nasser had planned for this exact moment. He instructed his military engineers, if I ever say the name Ferdinand de Lesseps in a public speech, it means commence the operation. Seize the Suez Canal. Immediately. Without hesitation. Why de Lesseps? Because de Lesseps was the Frenchman who built the canal with the blood of 100,000 Egyptians. Because his name is the symbol of everything that was taken. And because no Western intelligence agency would ever think to flag the name of a dead French diplomat in a speech about a dam. Nasser says the name. And somewhere in the audience, Egyptian military officers move. Nasser keeps speaking. His voice rises. He begins to list every grievance, every humiliation, every imperial crime committed against Egypt for 70 years. The crowd is catching fire. They understand now. This is not a speech. This is a declaration. And then he says the words that will change everything. Today, in the name of the people, I am taking the Suez Canal Company. The canal belongs to Egypt. The canal was dug by Egyptians. 120,000 Egyptians died digging it. Tonight, our flag flies over the canal. And from this moment forward, the canal belongs to the Egyptian people. The Suez Canal Company is hereby nationalized. The speech goes on for nearly 3 hours in total. By the end, Nasser is hoarse, exhausted, held upright by sheer adrenaline. The crowd is in a state of collective ecstasy. And in London, Paris, and Washington, 3 separate governments are trying to understand what just happened. Anthony Eden receives the news at a dinner party. He excuses himself. He walks to his study. He closes the door. And according to witnesses who saw him later that evening, his face was white. Not angry. Not frightened. Possessed. To understand what Anthony Eden does next, you have to understand what Anthony Eden was. Eden was the golden boy of British politics. Handsome. Elegant. The man who stood up to Neville Chamberlain's appeasement of Hitler in 1938 by resigning from the cabinet, a move that made him a moral hero overnight. He served as Churchill's foreign secretary through World War II. He was the heir apparent, waiting decades for Churchill to finally step aside. When he became Prime Minister in 1955, he was supposed to be the man who modernized Britain. Instead, he became the man who destroyed it. Eden looked at Nasser, and he did not see a nationalist leader from a developing country. He saw Adolf Hitler. This was not rhetorical. Eden's advisors and friends later testified that he genuinely, obsessively believed it. Nasser's book The Philosophy of the Revolution, which spoke of Arab unity from the Atlantic to the Gulf. Eden read as Mein Kampf in Arabic. Nasser's radio broadcasts, which reached millions across the Arab world. Eden heard as Hitler's speeches on the radio. Nasser's nationalization of the canal. Eden saw as the remilitarization of the Rhineland. I want him destroyed, Eden told his private secretary. I want him murdered. The problem was, you cannot simply invade a country that has not attacked you. The United Nations would condemn it. The United States would not support it. The British public, weary of war, would not accept it. So Eden needed a pretext. And that is where the French come in. The French had their own reasons for hating Nasser. Nasser was supporting the Algerian independence movement, the FLN, which was fighting a brutal war of liberation against French colonial rule. To Paris, Nasser was not just an annoyance. He was actively arming and funding the people killing French soldiers. Guy Mollet, the French Prime Minister, was a socialist with a weak government. But on Nasser, he was as hardline as Eden. The two men found each other naturally. And then there was the third partner. Israel. Israel had its own reasons. Since 1949, Egypt had blockaded the Straits of Tiran, choking off Israeli shipping access to the Red Sea. Nasser was funding Fedayeen raids into Israeli territory. And Israel's military leadership, led by the young and aggressive Moshe Dayan, believed that war with Egypt was inevitable sooner or later. Better to fight on their own terms, with two European powers as allies. So the three nations, Britain, France, and Israel, began to plan. The meeting that sealed the conspiracy took place in a private villa in Sèvres, just outside Paris, from October 22 to 24, 1956. The Israeli delegation was led by David Ben-Gurion himself, the founding father of Israel, a 70-year-old giant with a halo of white hair and the intensity of a prophet. The French sent their top military and political leadership. The British sent their Foreign Secretary, Selwyn Lloyd, who arrived almost comically in disguise, wearing a trench coat and trying to avoid being recognized. The plan they devised was elegant in its cynicism. It was also, objectively, insane. Israel would invade Egypt across the Sinai Peninsula. They would advance toward the Suez Canal. And then, Britain and France would issue an ultimatum: both Egypt and Israel must withdraw 10 miles from the canal. Egypt, of course, would refuse. The canal was inside their own territory. And then Britain and France, posing as peacekeepers protecting international shipping, would bomb Egyptian positions, land troops, and seize the canal. It was, in the words of one British civil servant present, the most disgraceful document a British government has ever signed. The Sèvres Protocol was signed on October 24. 3 copies. Ben-Gurion kept one. The French kept one. And the British copy, this is important, was kept in a safe, with instructions that it should be destroyed if the operation was ever exposed. Eden lied to the House of Commons. He lied to his own cabinet. He lied to President Eisenhower. When American intelligence began picking up signs of the conspiracy, Eden dismissed the reports as sheer nonsense. And then, on October 29, 1956, Israel attacked. The military operation was brilliant. The political operation was a catastrophe. On October 29th, Israeli paratroopers dropped into the Mitla Pass in the Sinai. Within hours, Israeli armor was racing across the desert. The Egyptian army, caught by surprise, put up scattered resistance but was overwhelmed. In 4 days, Israel controlled the entire Sinai Peninsula. On October 30th, as planned, Britain and France issued their ultimatum. Egypt, as predicted, rejected it. On October 31st, British and French planes began bombing Egyptian airfields. The Egyptian Air Force was destroyed on the ground. Nasser ordered his pilots not to take off, he knew they would be massacred. Instead, he gave a different order. Scuttle every ship in the Suez Canal. 49 ships were sunk in the canal. Concrete blocks were dropped into the waterway. The canal, the thing everyone was fighting over, was rendered completely unusable. Nasser's logic was brutal and simple: if I cannot have it, nobody can. On November 5th, British and French paratroopers landed at Port Said. The first major airborne assault since World War II. Marines came ashore from the sea. Fighting was fierce in the streets, but the outcome was never in doubt. And then, the roof collapsed. President Eisenhower was furious. He had been lied to by his closest ally. He was in the middle of a re-election campaign, literally days before the vote, and his Secretary of State had helped create a crisis that could spiral into World War III. Because there was one thing the conspirators had not accounted for. On November 4th, Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest to crush the Hungarian Revolution. Thousands were dying. The world's attention was there. And Britain and France had chosen exactly this moment to launch a colonial invasion of an Arab country. They had handed the Soviet Union the perfect propaganda weapon. But Eisenhower's fury was not just about geopolitics. It was about money. The British pound was collapsing. Since the invasion began, international markets were dumping sterling. Britain's gold reserves were bleeding out. And here is the crucial detail: Britain needed a loan from the International Monetary Fund to survive. That loan required American approval. Eisenhower's Treasury Secretary called his British counterpart with a simple message. You can have the loan as soon as you withdraw from Egypt. The British pleaded. Couldn't the Americans at least support the pound while the operation was completed? They just needed a few more days. A week at most. The canal would be secured. Nasser would fall. The answer was no. Not unless you stop. The Americans were not bluffing. They sold pounds on the open market to accelerate the collapse. They blocked British access to oil reserves. They positioned the Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean, not to help the British and French, but to monitor them. Eden was told, in no uncertain terms, that he could continue the invasion if he wanted. His military was already in Egypt. His troops were in control. But his country would be bankrupt within a week. November 6, 1956. 7 days after the first Israeli paratroopers jumped. Anthony Eden walked into the cabinet room at 10 Downing Street. He looked according to one minister present, like a man who had aged 20 years in a single week. He told his cabinet that Britain would accept a ceasefire. There was no applause, no relief, just silence. British forces had advanced 42 kilometers down the canal. They had not reached Suez City. They would never reach it. The invasion stopped where it stood. The withdrawal took weeks. By December, British and French forces were gone, replaced by the first-ever United Nations peacekeeping force, a Canadian idea that created the modern concept of blue helmet peacekeepers. Israeli forces took longer to leave, finally withdrawing from Sinai in March 1957 under intense American pressure. And what was gained? The canal was blocked. It remained closed until April 1957. Egypt kept the canal. Nasser kept the canal. He became, overnight, the undisputed leader of the Arab world. His photograph hung in every souk, every cafe, every home from Casablanca to Baghdad. The man Anthony Eden had wanted to destroy was now untouchable. As for the conspirators, Guy Mollet's government survived the immediate crisis but collapsed within months. The Fourth French Republic itself fell the following year, replaced by de Gaulle's Fifth Republic. French humiliation at Suez accelerated the loss of Algeria, and with it, the entire French colonial empire. David Ben-Gurion got what he wanted, an end to the blockade, UN peacekeepers stationed in Sinai, and 11 years of relative quiet on the Egyptian border. But he also learned a permanent lesson. Never trust European promises. From Suez onward, Israel knew it could rely only on itself. And Anthony Eden? On November 20th, 1956, Eden left London for Jamaica. Officially, he was resting. In reality, his doctors feared he was having a complete physical and mental breakdown. He had been taking amphetamines and barbiturates for months. He was barely sleeping. His judgment was destroyed. He returned to London in December. On January 9, 1957, he resigned as Prime Minister. His farewell broadcast to the nation was a broken, rambling defense of everything he had done. He never admitted the conspiracy. He never apologized. He went to his grave insisting he had been right. He retired to a house in Wiltshire. He grew roses. He wrote his memoirs, 3 volumes of self-justification that convinced almost no one. He lived another 20 years, healthy and wealthy and completely removed from power, watching as the empire he had tried to save disintegrated piece by piece. He died in 1977. His obituaries were kind. They mentioned his good looks, his elegance, his heroism against appeasement. And then, in the 7th or 8th paragraph, they mentioned Suez. In 2015, Egypt opened a new expansion of the Suez Canal. It cost $8 billion. It was built entirely by Egyptians. The ceremony was attended by presidents and kings and sheikhs, and the man presiding over it was Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, another Egyptian military officer turned president. No British officials attended. The canal now handles about 12% of all global trade. Ships from China, America, Europe, everywhere, pass through it every day. the world's economy still flows through the ditch that killed 100,000 Egyptians and one British Empire. The Suez Crisis lasted less than 2 weeks. The fighting killed fewer than 3,000 people. It was, by the standards of the 20th century, a small war. But it changed everything. After Suez, Britain never again launched a major military operation without American approval, or at least, not without catastrophic consequences. The special relationship was redefined, permanently, as a hierarchy rather than a partnership. British prime ministers would spend the next 60 years learning the lesson Eden refused to accept. You are the junior partner now. Act accordingly. France drew the opposite conclusion. Never trust the Americans. Build your own nuclear weapons. Chart your own course. De Gaulle pulled France out of NATO's integrated command. He vetoed British entry into the European Economic Community. The French suspicion of Anglo-American power that drives French foreign policy to this day was forged in the fire of Suez. And the Middle East? The Middle East was remade. Nasser's victory electrified the Arab world. Arab nationalism became a genuine political force. Regimes across the region rushed to adopt his rhetoric, nationalize their resources, and break free from Western domination. The ripple effects touched Iraq, Syria, Libya, Algeria, Yemen. The map of the modern Middle East, for better and for worse, was drawn in the aftermath of 1956. But the deepest wound, the one that never healed, was psychological. Suez proved that the world was no longer run by Europeans. Two of the most powerful empires in history, the British and the French, had tried to impose their will by force, and they had been stopped. Not by the Soviet Union, not by an opposing army, but by economics, by diplomacy, by a Texan president who did not want his re-election interrupted by a colonial war. The age of empire was over. Everyone knew it now. The only people who had not accepted it were the ones who started the war. On the Mediterranean coast, near Port Said, there is a small monument. It does not commemorate the Suez Crisis. It commemorates something older, the opening of the canal in 1869. It is a plinth with a statue that used to stand there. The statue was of Ferdinand de Lesseps. His right arm extended, welcoming the world to his canal. In 1956, after the invasion failed, a crowd pulled the statue down. The plinth is still there. Empty. No one has ever replaced the statue. No one has ever suggested what should stand there instead. And every day, 1,000 ships sail past that empty plinth, carrying the world's trade through a canal built on the bones of 100,000 Egyptians, seized by an empire that no longer exists, and nationalized in a single speech by the son of a postman. The canal belongs to Egypt. It always did.